Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on managing the impact of Brexit. My name is Alison Blackhurst. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions, and I'm accompanied this afternoon by my colleague, Sue Watson, who's our HR Operations Manager. I will be leading the seminar. Sue will be dealing with, hopefully, no technical problems at all that arise as we go through, but if anyone has a problem logging in or anything like that, then she will be helping with those. And also she will be monitoring any questions that you may send her during the session. So please do feel free to send her any messages. We will be fielding as many questions as we can at the end, but any ones that we either don't have time for or else that we feel are so particular to your business that they're not really of general import to everybody else, we will actually follow up with an email to you afterwards. So if you do have any questions as you go through, do note them down and drop us a line so that we can actually get back to you. So today's topics. Well, it's now just over 3 months since the momentous Brexit vote, and the shock of the outcome now seems a lifetime away in reality. June seems a long, long time ago. But Brexit is still appearing in the news headlines on a daily basis. While things may seem to have calmed down a bit, and whilst most of us would welcome a clear way forward, it would seem that in reality we're going to be managing in a period of uncertainty for at least the next couple of years. So what we're looking at today really is how can we best plan for this and how can we reduce the risk. And the key factors we think will be clear communication to allay fears and immediate concerns, taking steps to reduce the risk of discrimination against current workers, and also some degree of risk assessment to ensure that you are prepared for a range of scenarios and changes to employment law. We'll also be looking at the future recruitment of migrant workers and also some tips on applying for residency and citizenship now. So what has changed since the referendum? Well, if we think back to June, goodness me, David Cameron was our Prime Minister prior to the result. He shocked many by stepping down as Prime Minister after what was a very hotly debated Remain campaign. Theresa May, who was in the Remain camp, of course, became our second female Prime Minister, and she is now faced with the unenviable task of navigating the country through an uncertain period as we negotiate the terms under which we will leave the European Union. In terms of dates and timescales, we've all been waiting with bated breath for this, and we now know that Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty will be triggered by the end of March 2017. We then have 2 years in which to leave the EU, so the UK will therefore leave the EU by March 2019. Now, Mrs May has also announced very recently plans to repeal the European Communities Act 1972. That's the key piece of legislation that gives direct effect to all European Union law in the UK, and to convert all existing EU law into domestic legislation. So we have a new bill known as the Great Repeal Bill, and this will mean that EU law will cease to apply from the day that the UK officially leaves the Union. But it also means that on the day we leave the EU, our law will be pretty much the same as it is today, and it can then be amended or repealed at a later stage by the UK Parliament. The bill will also include powers for ministers to make some changes through secondary legislation while the Brexit negotiations take place. Now, the outcome did see an immediate impact in exchange rates and share prices. The pound fell by almost 11% against the euro on the day the results were released, and it has subsequently fallen to a 31-year low against the dollar. The lowest was $1.1491. And the pound's failed to regain any significant momentum, still hovering at around about 12% lower than it was pre-Brexit, although it does seem to have stabilised at this rate. This obviously has had a big effect not only on our holiday spending, but also particularly on import and export costs. Goods are more expensive to import, but we become more competitive with our exports. The Times reported last week that Cabinet Ministers are being warned that the Treasury could lose up to $66 billion a year in tax revenues if we have a hard Brexit. That's according to leaked government papers. And that figure amounts to nearly 1/10 of the amount we collect in taxes and 65% of the annual budget of the NHS in England. And the forecasts are also showing that GDP could fall by as much as 9.5% if we leave the single market and if we have to rely on World Trade Organization rules for trading with Europe. Such a steep drop in revenue would force ministers to slash public spending or raise taxes. Some employers have reported that staff are intending to leave. Some are now reporting problems recruiting from abroad because they're finding that people are less inclined to take the risk of coming here. And the responses amongst employers seem to vary hugely, from those who are taking an ostrich approach, or one which is just a wait and see, to those who've actually taken enormous steps by setting up task forces, working parties, daily updates, and also dedicated intranets dealing purely with Brexit. But apart from the changes that have been brought about by the fluctuating exchange rates, reports that suggest that things have changed or improved or worsened since the vote can be misleading because, of course, while we may have voted to leave the EU, we actually haven't done so yet, so most business continues as normal. The British Chambers of Commerce reports an increase in sales in manufacturing, but a decline in sales in the services sector, and its survey, which was published last week, found that the UK economy is still growing, but at a lower level than before the referendum. And it supports the forecast of growth of 1% in 2017. So in reality, in terms of which aspects of life Brexit has affected so far, the majority of individuals have mentioned overseas property and the cost of living or travelling abroad, the value of the pension schemes, concerns about work and about employment. So, how many migrant workers do you have? Well, there are an estimated 3 million EEA citizens working here at any one time, which comes to around about 5% of the UK population. We also have an estimated 1.2 million British citizens who are working elsewhere in the EEA, and it is important not to forget about them. Many of these may be worried about whether they're going to be permitted to stay in the UK or the EU after we actually leave the European community. So what will the impact on your business be? Well, apart from the obvious concerns of the migrant workers, all workers, irrespective of the nationality, may well be worrying about the effect of Brexit now, and the more press coverage that we're having and the fact that it continues day in, day out means that it is something that we are continuing to see concerns about. The CIPD ran a survey which found that 44% of working adults felt pessimistic about the future as a result of the vote to leave, and 1 in 5 thought their job was less secure. And their concerns extend beyond employment status and job security to all sorts of other issues which could be impacted by the vote. For example, business closures and redundancies, especially in the fall in exchange, if the fall in exchange rates is an issue for your business, or if trade tariffs are likely to result in fewer sales. Many employees are concerned about their pensions, about the value of the pension schemes. Trustees of defined benefit schemes will be very worried about falling share prices, and those who have defined contribution schemes are seeing the value of their pension pot decline when they look at buying an annuity. And with interest rates so low, it's hard to contemplate living on the interest gained on their capital. Many of us were hoping that interest rates on savings would actually start to rise fairly soon, but there is absolutely no sign of that, and there doesn't seem to be. Others are worried about the impact on public and private services that rely on migrants, such as the health service and the care sector. And other employers are worried about day-to-day things like holidays abroad. Apart from the fact that holidays are costing more due to the fall in the pound, are we going to need visas in future, or just more robust passport controls? Is this the end of the EU queue at the airports? Will our EHIC cards no longer be valid, etc.? And the fall in the pound has meant an increase in the price of fuel. This is now at its highest level for a year, with petrol costing an average of more than 114.6p a litre and diesel more than 112p, and with further jumps expected. So most families are facing an average increase of £14 a month for fuel alone, and campaigners have called for the government to freeze fuel duty to ease the pressure on household budgets. So we have a full range of concerns. The TUC has issued a joint statement with the CBI, asking the government to allay the concerns of EU nationals working in the UK and UK citizens working in the EU, and to reassure workers worried about the impact of Brexit. But in the meantime, it is sensible for all employers to take any steps they can do to reassure employees. The more your employees are worrying about external factors, the more likely it is that it's going to affect your productivity and their morale generally. So anything you can actually do to reassure them is going to be good news. So if we look firstly very generally, what we would be advising is, if you haven't already done this, and obviously some employers already have, then do appoint somebody within your business to take responsibility for managing the people aspects of Brexit, and then ensure that this person works in very close liaison with the members of staff who are assessing the potential commercial and finance implications. Inform your staff about how you are responding to Brexit and the key areas of concern to your business. There may be all sorts of things that they actually haven't thought about already, but things that also will reassure them. And tell them that you will continue to update them about any potential changes as the negotiations about our future relationship with Europe progresses, and as the likely implications become clearer. One of the key sources of concern is not knowing what's going to happen. Once people know what's going to happen, they can start to plan for it, but uncertainty can create a huge amount of stress for workers. But as so much is uncertain, do stick to the facts and don't speculate. This will result in a loss of trust if things turn out differently. It's perfectly okay, as we are doing to you, to say that we don't know what the consequences may be at a particular point in time, as this will depend on a variety of factors, and in particular what kind of exit deal is eventually negotiated. So don't make promises you can't keep. They could be used against you in the future. We would advise all employers to avoid giving a political view, as it could alienate some workers, and also to ensure that communications do remain respectful regardless of what you think about various factors of how things are developing. And keep communications open and ongoing. Consider having regular Q&A sessions or regular briefings as new information emerges. When it comes to the migrant workers themselves, who are they and how many do you have? Check your right to work documentation and identify how many and which of your employees are EEA recruits. Now, you may well find as well that your right to work documentation doesn't actually tell you that if it's been restricted only to taking up checks for people who are non-EU nationals. So it could well be a case of going all the way back to application forms to find out the nationality of all of your employees and find out which ones are actually EEA recruits. Have a look to see which areas of your business they work in and in which roles. Are they all focused in particular areas, and are these key roles? And reassure them that their right to work in the UK is unlikely to change in the short to medium term. At the moment, EU nationals continue to be able to move freely and to work and live in member states, including the UK, until such time as we leave the EU. So these workers may be feeling particularly vulnerable at the moment, so therefore individual conversations and reassurance from the employer may be very, very welcome. Get together a list of all of your EEA recruits and ensure that any new EEA recruits are added to the lists for ease of quick communication in the future, so that you can contact them all quickly if and when changes are announced. Have a look to see, are your workers employed in business critical roles, or ones where it is particularly hard to recruit? For those in business critical roles in particular, you might want to consider taking proactive steps to help them to continue to live and work in the UK by explaining the rules to them or supporting them in their applications for permanent UK residence or other options. Now, depending on the size of your business and the resources available to you, this might just add up to signposting them to useful websites, or providing a Q&A sheet on residency, citizenship and workers' options. Or if resources permit, it could extend to providing and or funding professional assistance and advice. Try to find out if any of your workers are considering leaving the UK. A new survey, again British Chambers of Commerce, found that 5% of organisations experienced resignations from their EU employees in the month following the referendum, and 10% said that some workers had said that they did intend to leave the UK. Stress that you value these employees and their contributions to the business. And finally, as I said before, don't forget any UK workers that are posted abroad. If you have these, they also need to be reassured that their situation will remain unchanged whilst we remain in the EU, i.e. for at least another 2 years. A UK national who has lived and worked in another EU member state for 5 years or more may be able to apply for long-term residency, and citizenship will be an option in some cases, but not all. Just turning to your other workers, well, as stated previously, most people have some concerns about Brexit, including the ones that voted to leave. So the advice has to be to offer reassurance and to deal openly and transparently with their own concerns about pay and pensions and job security. The latter particularly if you're owned by a non-UK company, but not to make any promises that you can't keep. Many companies have released statements, including profit warnings, since the outcome of the vote. So if the changes in the exchange rates or other financial pressures are going to delay any of your normal procedures, for example, a pay review, or they could change your recruitment or training plans, then do let your employees know this as soon as possible and the new timescale for decisions. It can be very disheartening and very demotivating if things like pay reviews are just missed and nobody makes a mention of them. So if you are going to be delaying them, tell everybody well in advance and then they can plan accordingly. Given the volatility of the financial markets, if you have your own pension scheme, then start talking to the trustees about plans to sustain financial stability. A communication from them which lays out the steps that are being taken to mitigate risks to the pension scheme may well be very, very useful. And reconfirm clear priorities for your business to try and refocus everyone on these rather than the concerns that they are having. Now, reducing the risk of discrimination. I've put beware of discrimination with an exclamation mark there because we all know how expensive discrimination claims can be. But apart from that, they lead to an awful lot of lack of motivation of staff, higher turnover and everything else. And what was very, very worrying immediately after the result of the vote was announced was the reports of abusive and violent behaviour to EU migrants following the vote, as well as abuse of those who are UK residents who actually voted to leave. Now, it may well be that you've already taken steps about all of this, in which case, sorry for repeating ourselves on this, but it would appear that the amount of problems are not declining as much as we would hope that they would do. The National Police Chiefs Council reported a 57% increase in hate crime immediately following the Brexit result. But you would think that that would die down as the flurry of shock turned into acceptance, but it didn't. The number of offences, including assaults, criminal damage and harassment, recorded by the police in July was 41% higher than in July 2015. The Home Office says that police logged 5,468 racially or religiously aggravated hate crimes in England and Wales that month, which is up from almost 4,000. It was 886 in July 2015. And although the number declined in August, they were still higher than 12 months previously. So the CRPD also did a bit of research, and they found that more than 1 in 10 employees, that's 13% was their figure, said that they'd experienced, witnessed or heard of incidents of harassment or bullying of a political nature, and just under 1 in 10 referenced incidents of a racist nature. So things may have died down a little, and you may have already covered this, but just in case you haven't, have you had a problem with discrimination or harassment, and do you anticipate one? Whatever steps you take should take into account the sort of business you have and the likely behaviour of your staff. But you may need to take active steps to protect all of your employees and third parties, such as your customers, clients and suppliers, from harassment from colleagues on the grounds of nationality, race or age. So if you haven't already done so, then do remind your staff that their colleagues and your customers will have voted for both sides. Brexit was a particularly divisive issue, and whilst people may have different views, and we accept that, and we accept that they also may be very, very strongly held, this is no excuse for racist or ageist behaviour in the workplace or towards your customers, clients or suppliers. So it may be time to have a look at your equal opportunities and bullying and harassment policies and to emphasise a zero tolerance approach to potentially discriminatory actions or remarks, including those on Facebook or other social media. If it's time to renew them, if you haven't actually looked at them for a while, then a timely reminder of any changes and updates would be appropriate. Is it a good time to do this now? Given that the Equality Act protects not only those with a protected characteristic, but also those who are discriminated against by association and by perception, the number of people that could potentially be offended by racist or ageist remarks is absolutely huge. Now, there's probably no need to ban any discussion of the outcome of the Brexit vote, as some employers are reported to have done. But a timely reminder to act appropriately to avoid offence and to avoid any discussions that might make your colleagues, customers, clients or suppliers feel unwelcome or embarrassed may well be useful. The risk of race discrimination is obvious. Political beliefs. Now, whilst these are not a protected characteristic themselves, under the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, the 2-year qualifying period needed to bring an unfair dismissal claim will not apply where the reason for a dismissal is or relates to an employee's political affiliations or opinions. So it is an area to watch. And age discrimination is also very, very relevant here because there was a very clear divide in voting patterns between older and younger voters. So insulting older or younger colleagues for the political views may be considered age discrimination. As ever, people will say, oh, it's just banter, it's just fun, we're having a laugh, we're having a joke. Really, it's better to explain to your staff that what they consider banter may be unacceptable, as is asking colleagues questions like when they're planning to go home, for example. If your managers hear of any inappropriate remarks, advise them to intervene very quickly with a quiet but very firm word. The idea is to keep a lid on all of this and to minimise escalation. And to emphasise the importance of respect at work and that your EU workers are valued. So focusing on the priorities of teamwork. So don't turn a blind eye. Take appropriate action quickly if this happens. Now, one of the questions has been, what changes are we likely to see to employment law? Now, as mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister has announced plans to repeal the European Communities Act 1972 and to convert all existing EU law into domestic legislation. So the new bill, which is known as the Great Repeal Bill, will mean effectively that EU law will cease to apply from the day that we officially leave the European Union. So, what it does mean, though, is that on the day that we do leave, our law will be broadly the same as it is today, because any European law will become UK law. So this can then be amended or repealed at a later stage by the UK Parliament. Now, Mrs May has tried to give some reassurance. What she actually has said very clearly, and I'm quoting now, existing workers' legal rights will continue to be guaranteed in law, and they will be guaranteed as long as I am Prime Minister. We're going to see workers' rights not eroded and not just protected, but enhanced under this government. And the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, David Davis, has also indicated that existing employment law will not be radically changed once the UK leaves the EU. He said regulations already in place will stay for the moment, but the flood of new regulation from Europe will be halted. So what we have at the moment, which emanated from Europe, will become UK law and will carry on exactly as it is until told otherwise, but all the new stuff that is coming into Europe after we leave will not become UK law unless we choose that to be the case. So our current legislation based on EU employment law won't just cease to apply, but it should be noted that whilst we have lots of regulations that have derived from EU directives, much of our employment law is anyway domestic law. For example, the right not to be unfairly dismissed, protection for whistleblowers, the national minimum wage and the national living wage, shared parental leave, the right to request flexible working, all of those are domestic law. They have not been imposed on us by Europe, and a lot of our equality legislation, again, is home-derived. For those that want to know what came from where, the House of Commons has published a briefing paper which actually lists the EU directives and their UK counterparts. So we already have a lot in place which is ours. It has not been imposed on us by the EU. Trade agreements that would allow us to continue to access the single market, such as the European Free Trade Area, or a decision to join the European Economic Area, could still require us to accept the majority of EU employment laws and regulations, because it's unlikely that EU countries are going to want to enter into trade and other agreements with us if we're able to undercut them by having less onerous and therefore cheaper employment terms. So if we look at Norway, for example, Norway is not a member of the EU, but it is a member of the European Economic Area for trade purposes. It has been obliged to accept most of the EU employment legislation. So maybe not as much change as we're thinking. We're also still going to be bound by decisions from the European Court of Human Rights, even if employment tribunal cases no longer go up to the Court of Justice for the European Union for a binding decision. And of course, we're very used to living with guidance from the Court of Justice, and our courts are likely still to be influenced by the outcome of cases that are heard there. Data protection is going to be a key issue initially, because we are required to implement the EU General Data Protection Regulations 2016 by May 2018, so before we're due to leave the EU. So whilst we remain in the EU and whilst we are EU members, we're going to have to comply with that, even if we later repeal these laws. But again, in reality, the UK is still going to need to comply with cross-border data protection laws if we want to keep trading with our European trading partners. And it's also likely to be in our interests to ensure that the transfers of personal data between the EU and the UK are easy to work for both us and them. And another consideration is if we're going to continue trading with EU member states, then our products are also still going to need to continue to meet EU health and safety standards, whether or not these are required by our domestic legislation. And this will also apply vice versa. Imported products from Europe are going to need to comply with our national health and safety standards. So this will affect not just consumer goods and food, for example, but also machinery and equipment. And producing different versions of the same product for different markets could have huge cost and logistical implications. Well, what might change or go? Well, a crystal ball would be very, very nice. So, and we wish we had one, but we don't. As I said earlier, we know that on day one, things are going to remain as they are. We do have some suggestions as to what may change, but what follows really is a bit of a wish list, and it's based on losing the things that have come from Europe that have proved so unpopular. Whether this will happen or not, given what Theresa May has said, is questionable now, actually. It may well be that a lot of the things that we thought we would like to see go may well stay for a bit longer. But here's a list of them. First of all, working time regulations, which of course started with the Working Time Directive and which were implemented in the UK with the Working Time Regulations. Now, whilst most of these will remain, the maximum 48-hour week may go. The UK has always been against the maximum 48-hour week and fought tooth and nail not to have that. It controversially retained the ability to opt out, but the maximum working week still remains unpopular. Now, as employees may choose to opt out individually anyway, a removal of that or a removal of the maximum 48-hour week might not have too much of an impact, except that it would reduce a lot of the onerous record-keeping requirements. Holiday pay, well, of course, we're still receiving regular updates on the cases that have been going up to Europe about the calculation of holiday pay. Now, the amount of paid holiday entitlement is unlikely to change. Although the original 4 weeks holiday came in via the EU directive, the additional 1.6 weeks was a UK enhancement, and it doesn't apply across the rest of Europe. But the recent European rulings that provide that regular overtime and commission should be reflected in holiday pay have been highly unpopular with employers. We, uniquely, already have legislation in the UK that prevents claims from going back for more than 2 years, but it might well be that statutory holiday pay reverts to basic contracted pay. So what do you do about that at the moment? Now, if you haven't already resolved this tricky issue, does this affect your plans regarding holiday pay? We're reading all of the solicitors' briefings that are coming out, and advisors are taking opposite views as to whether to reach an agreement on holiday pay now or to sit on the fence, because as things may change, you might decide not to take action now. But what we would advise anyway is that you certainly accrue the difference in your accounts. So that is the difference between basic pay and actual pay for all of your staff for 4 weeks of the year multiplied by 2 years, which is the maximum limitation period. So make sure you do have the money in your accounts if you actually find that you do have to pay that. But you may decide not to do anything other than that at this stage. Accruing holiday whilst on long-term sick, again something that's proved very, very unpopular, and possibly also the accrual of holiday whilst on long-term family leave. The accrual of holiday and the ability to carry this forward if not taken by the end of the holiday year. It may be stopped altogether or it could be limited in some way. Discrimination? Well, we're unlikely to see any change to the protected characteristics set out in the Equality Act because these are now well accepted and well entrenched, really. What we might see, however, is the introduction of a cap on discrimination compensatory awards, similar to the one that applies to unfair dismissal. EU law currently forbids us doing this, but a YouGov survey carried out in 2012 found that 55% of people were in favour of this, and discrimination awards can be very, very high indeed, so that is something that an awful lot of employers would welcome. 2P, well, that originally comes from EU law, but it's enshrined in UK regulations. Making changes may well be impractical, and let's not forget that the government opted to retain the service provision change arrangements back in 2014. So whilst it's unpopular, it's probably likely to remain as it is at the moment, except that we may see the ability to harmonise terms and conditions after a transfer, which will be very welcome. And also we may see a relaxation of the consultation provisions and the penalties for failure to consult. Redundancies, collective consultation. The minimum periods have already been reduced, but some people have suggested that this might go further, so that, for example, the 20+ redundancy collective consultation laws, which do stem originally from an EU directive, might be removed. That would mean that collective consultation would only then be required when 100 people or more are affected. Agency workers, universally unpopular, the regulations, not the workers themselves. The agency workers regulations derive entirely from EU law, and in particular the requirement to offer equal terms and benefits to agency workers after 12 weeks has been very unpopular. Now, these regulations could be significantly amended or even repealed entirely, and they may be a very easy one to lose. It would only require secondary legislation, and it could prove a quick political gain for the government because employers dislike them, and unions generally are pretty ambivalent because membership amongst temporary workers is very low anyway, so they're unlikely to put up a fight on that one. And then finally, consultation and the information and consultation of employees legislation, which comes from EU laws. And if we join the European Economic Area, then European Works Councils will not be affected. But if we don't, then the situation's a bit less clear, and the default position is that they would continue to apply because they're a form of collective agreement. However, it is likely that the law could be amended there so that UK employers will not be required to set up European Works Councils, and European employers will not be required to include UK employees in their European Work Councils. But again, all of this is very much speculation. What is clear is that any change is unlikely to be quick and that we will know about it with plenty of notice. So really the actions to take here are to be aware of the things that may well change and to bear that in mind when you're actually planning any changes yourselves to terms and conditions, but certainly to reassure staff and managers that any significant changes to their employment rights are highly unlikely in the short to medium term. So tell staff that you will keep them informed and that you will consult with them about any changes, and watch our newsletters for details of government consultations and future changes to legislation. For now, freedom of movement continues. Yep. In the short term, the free movement of workers should continue, so employers can continue to recruit new e-workers right up to the point when we exit the EU, but it might be that candidates are more reluctant to move here due to uncertainty about their future employment. But one thing to note very clearly is if you are recruiting staff at the moment, the normal rules still apply. You must continue to consider any applications from EU nationals, and you can't prioritise candidates from the UK. The government is under significant political pressure to cut EU migration, so in the longer term it's highly probable that the free movement of labour within the EEA will cease. And it's also possible that EU citizens that come here between now and our exit from the EU will not have a permanent right to live and work here. So we will need some new immigration rules. The Prime Minister has rejected the idea of an Australian point-style system on the basis that it wouldn't achieve the aims. We currently have a 5-tier point-based system for non-EU migrants, and Tier 3 technically covers low-skilled roles, but it has never been used because these roles have always been filled by EU workers. If all non-UK citizens are going to need work permits to work here, then the obvious solution would be to open Tier 3 to both EU and non-EU workers, possibly with a cap on numbers. It's going to mean a lot more administration for everybody though. If we look firstly at the skilled roles in Tier 2, there is currently a cap on the number of non-EU workers that can come here under Tier 2. If EU workers are going to count towards this could result in recruitment issues for skilled staff, because if they have to qualify under Tier 2 of the points-based system, then they're going to be in the same pot as the non-EU workers, if you like. Yeah? Employers will only be able to employ them if they can demonstrate that there's no British national suitable for the role, which normally involves advertising the position first. So there are going to be cost implications to that, and if EU migrants are going to be treated the same as non-EU migrants, then effectively under the point system employers pay upfront costs of at least $2,000 to sponsor an individual for a 5-year work visa. That's the cost of applying for work permits, visas, and also the NHS supplement that they pay. And these costs are due to rise to at least $7,000 a year with the introduction of the immigration skills charge in April 2017. Employers who are unused to recruiting from non-EU countries are going to need to become registered sponsors and comply with the incredibly onerous record keeping and reporting duties. Are we going to be required to publish the proportion of international staff on the payroll? Well, Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, made an announcement about that last week, but despite assurances that this would not result in naming and shaming, the proposal did not go down well with the CBI, and apparently ministers are still considering whether to ask companies for this information. But they have given reassurances that the information would remain private and would be used only to identify skills gaps and to inform visa application decisions. Amber also announced plans to require employers to prove they've done all they can to find UK workers to fill a vacancy before being allowed to recruit from outside the UK. And she put forward plans for a visa entry scheme for skilled migrants. And under the most recent plan, the idea is that EU tourists and students would continue to have free access to come to Britain, but low-skilled immigrants would not be able to come here. And it's expected that the EU would in turn impose a visa scheme that would mirror that. So Britons would need a work permit to work in skilled jobs in Europe with no scope to go to do unskilled work. Starting to get a little quicker because I am aware of the time and I don't want to run out here. But actions, yes. First of all, check that all new offer letters and contracts of employment contain continued right to work clauses. Yeah. Look at the effect that it will have on you. If you rely on seasonal or low-skilled EEA labour, then it is worth exploring alternative strategies to think about the range of potential outcomes, even if you never need to action your plans. Consider, are there any other ways of meeting your recruitment needs? How might you be able to fill any vacancies from the UK labour market? Is this the time to look at apprenticeships or other training, particularly given the forthcoming apprenticeship levy? Yeah. What can you do to improve your retention? Might it worth be considering outsourcing? Note that if your EU migrants are going to be treated the same as non-EU workers, then there's going to be a hefty cost implication for you. Yeah. The cost of applying for the visas, the work permits, the NHS supplements. Employers who are unused to recruiting from non-EU countries are going to need to become registered sponsors. You're going to have to do an awful lot more paperwork. So for those who want to stay, the rules are, for those with less than 5 years in the UK, EEA workers may apply now for an EEA registration certificate. That shows they're in the UK exercising the right of freedom of movement. Now, this may not enable them to stay in the UK indefinitely, but it may well help to protect their right to continue to live and work here. If they have 5 years in the UK, that's 5 years uninterrupted time in the UK, which has been spent working, studying or actively seeking work or being self-sufficient, then they can apply for permanent residence here. It only costs £65 to do that. It may well be worth doing. And it's worth seeking advice about the requirements because, for example, self-employed individuals have to have held comprehensive health insurance in order to qualify for permanent residency. And those with 6 or more years in the UK may be able to apply for British citizenship. There are other criteria, all of which have to be met, and it's not normally necessary to surrender original citizenship, but do note that some countries don't recognise dual nationality. So encourage your EU workers who may wish to stay to consider applying for the above and to start thinking about it now. Tell them to start collating the documentation that they're going to need, such as bank statements, tenancy agreements, pay slips, because any application for immigration will require supporting evidence, and some of the comments on Facebook and other social media indicate that the amount of paperwork is incredibly onerous. Yep. Consider whether any of your employees need help in taking the English language and life in the UK tests. Should you or they be taking steps to improve their English? And I advise them not to leave it too late because it's likely there's going to be a flood of applications and processing times could be very, very lengthy. On our portal, we do have guides on checking the right to work in the UK, foreign nationals and work permits. We have template contracts and policies, and you also might like to have a look at the CIPD survey that I mentioned earlier. The CIPD now has an entire resource dedicated to Brexit and the employment law implications of that, so we'll also be keeping you abreast through our newsletters of any changes that come up. I was hoping to deal with questions, but I realise that we actually have now got to the full hour. So I'm going to have to call it a day there, but anybody that wants to send any questions in, please do so, and we will get back to you individually on any points you wish to raise. But thank you very much for attending this session. I hope you find it very, very useful, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Bye-bye.